Great. Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshenu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעשות.
B'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So here we go with this is the final chapter of Parshat Ki Tisa, and we'll take a look at what it says. Right? Ki yeh riv bein anashim, when there is a quarrel between two people, they're quarreling. V'nikshu el hamishpat v'shvatum, and they should go to court. They should go for judgment, right? And they will be judged. The case should be adjudicated. V'hitzdiku et hatzadik, and they should declare the righteous person righteous. They should show that he is in the right, right? V'hirshiu et harasha, and the one who is wicked, the one who's doing something wrong here, he should be found guilty of that. So let's take a look. So you can see that the issue of human beings not being able to get along is as long as probably people have been thinking. Well, I mean, we go all the way back to Cain and Abel, at least in terms of the literature of the Bible. But the idea of the necessity of being able to take these particular situations and finding an equitable way, a just way in which to determine the right and wrong of a particular case is terribly important. And if Jews are known to be litigious, we can find a source right here in the Torah regarding this. So, kihi yeriv, in a case where there is a quarrel. So this is from the Sifrei, right? The halachic midrash on Numbers and Deuteronomy. So it says, Sofam liyot nigashim el hamishpat. In the end, this quarrel will wind up in court. That's essentially what this is saying. Literally, it means their end will be to show up in court. Amor me'ata. So we can say from here, Ein shalom yotze mitoch meriva. There is no peace that comes as a result of a quarrel. In other words, I think, because this isn't so clear as to the point that Rashi's making, but we'll finish up the sentence and see. But I think the point that he's making here is that in a situation where there's a quarrel, you need a third party in order to bring harmony and peace to this situation. To bring this quarrel to a close requires at least a third party. That's what I'm thinking, in looking at the context of this sentence. Mi garam lalot. So now he goes on to say, what caused Lot, lifros min hatzadik, to have to separate from the righteous one, meaning, of course, Abraham. So, it just never was going to wind up in that quarrel that they had. And the Midrash goes into various types of quarrels that they had. Essentially, the Torah mentions a quarrel between the shepherds of Lot and the shepherds of Abraham. But what caused this for them to have to part company? In other words, there could not be peace between the two of them. They couldn't get along. Heve omer zo meriva. In other words, it was the quarrel that got them to split up. They would not have split up were it not a quarrel between the two. And the thing is that you've got two sides, but each side believing that they are in the right. And there is no way to resolve that except, obviously, to have it adjudicated and hope that you are going to a good court where all the facts of the case are considered and where justice is applied. So, the hirshiu et harasha. So, of course, you can see that this word rasha, which means wicked, right? Rasha means the wicked one, right? So it's an interesting usage of language, right? And what Rashi understands by this hirshiu is means that they are going to cause something wicked to befall the wicked one. In other words, the wicked person is going to get his just deserts, right? He is going to get what he deserves, right? So he says, this is a very interesting uh, passage in, I assume, the Sifrei again. Yachol, it's possible. In other words, in examining this phrase, we might assume, based on the fact that it says they shall punish the wicked one, right? Kol hamitchayvin badin, that anyone who is found guilty in a court, lukin, are beaten. So, Talmud Lomar, so he goes on to the next sentence. He says, for this reason, scripture states. So I'm going to have to hold you in suspense for a moment because I don't know that we've really ever maybe discussed this particular issue. That in fact, uh, awarding stripes, if you want to call it awarding, right? Punishing a person by being beaten is something that is in the Torah, that Jewish law clearly approves of. There's actually a tractate called Makot in the Mishnah that deals with this particular situation. There is, again, this is something to think about because basically I don't believe we use punishment of that kind in our society. There certainly are places in the world where they will, where a court will administer physical, corporal punishment. Corporal punishment is clearly something that the Torah considers as being an appropriate way of correction. And I think that certainly as you read about it in the Torah, you realize that the idea is ultimately society to benefit. So there's always this interesting question that I don't know that we think about sufficiently ourselves. Individual, the individual's needs versus society's needs, and which has to come first. And I think that in general, from the Torah's point of view, society's needs come first. And I don't think it's only the Torah that considers that to be the case. But clearly, individualism and the needs of the individual, at least in our modern Western society, take a huge, huge place. And I feel in some ways certainly come in a position and take precedence over the needs of a society. But clearly, we live within that society. In a sense, you could say, metaphorically, it's the oxygen we breathe. And to destroy a society ultimately is to destroy the individuals in that society. And that's one argument as to why a society's needs have to come first. That's a generalization. How do you deal with it in the specifics? And the Torah is going to have to deal with that. Well, I do believe that the idea is that, and the Torah says this from time to time, that when these things are made public, people learn a lesson. And it's a great disincentive to commit crime, to do things that are wrong. If you know that the consequences are going to be severe, you might think twice about doing that particular act. Does it occur 100%? Well, almost nothing is 100%, but does it increase the probabilities of a society that is willing to abide by law? I think it does. And you have to deal with probabilities and percentages. So, at any rate, I did feel it was necessary to go into that a little bit because clearly they're talking about corporal punishment. And you'll see it's very, very severe. Let me go on to the next sentence. So here we go. So they didn't mention corporal punishment here. They just said, they found the wicked one guilty, right? V'haya, and in a case, im bin hakot, if the harasha is the next one, right? If the guilty party is deserving of corporal punishment, the hakot is to beat, right? So if he is deserving of corporal punishment. V'hipilo hashofet, the judge will have to explain what hipilo. Linpol means literally to fall, right? The judge should cause him to fall, but we'll explain what that means. V'hikahu, and he shall be beaten. Lefanav, before him. In other words, in the presence of the judge has to be present. He can't just simply, give the verdict and leave. This takes place to try and make these considerations very serious. Kedei rishato, according to his wickedness, according to the degree of wickedness, b'mispar, according by number. And all that is going to be explained in the Rashi. What is meant by this? So, the Torah actually will mention a number right afterwards, but let's just keep going back to the Rashi because Rashi actually had a run-on line here, right? So we were saying, that in this first, if we were to think that anybody who is found guilty in court, and it's not a capital offense, is to have to submit to corporal punishment. V'haya im bin hakot harasha. So the Torah goes on to say, if he is deserving of stripes. So, pa'amim luka. So there are times when he may, in fact, have to receive corporal punishment. Ufa'amim eno luka. But there are also times when he doesn't. Because it says, im bin hakot, if in fact he is deserving of corporal punishment, which clearly indicates there may be times when he's not. Okay. Umi ha luka. So how do we determine someone who is to receive stripes? How do we know what crime, quote, quote, a person is, or sin a person has committed to deserve stripes? Lamod min ha'anyan. So he says we have to look at the context of this particular passage, these passages. And right after this particular halacha, this piece of legislation, it goes on to say, the Torah goes on to say, Lo tachsom shor b'di shor. You shall not muzzle an ox when it is threshing. B'di shor, here we go. So how do we define that statement? Thou shalt not muzzle an ox when it is threshing. So it is defined as love, and in other words, it's a negative commandment. Thou shalt not, shelo nitaklase, that is not connected to a positive commandment. In other words, it just simply says you shall not muzzle an ox when it is threshing. In other words, any time there's a commandment that is simply and straightforward a negative commandment and isn't attached to a positive commandment. Let me give you an example. So it says, for example, when you come upon a nest of a mother bird over fledglings or eggs, right? You shall not take both. Negative commandment. But essentially it then goes on to say, but you shall chase away the mother bird and take the eggs and the fledglings. That is a positive statement. So there is an example of a negative commandment that is attached to a positive commandment. But here, where it says, you shall not muzzle an ox, and there is no positive commandment following it, for example, to say, it might have gone on to say, but you shall make sure that the ox can eat whatever food it wants to while it's threshing. Doesn't say that, just has, you shall not muzzle an ox. So the context here we have of awarding stripes is strictly in a context of a negative commandment without any positive commandment attached to it. So again, and it's not a positive commandment. You do not receive stripes if you're found guilty of an infraction of a positive commandment. So that's the context there. All right. So going on, remember we said the judge shall cause him to fall down. What does it mean? It doesn't mean, of course, that he should knock him down or anything like that. Melamed. So what this does is it teaches us she'ein malkin oto omed lo omed. He that when this person is awarded these stripes, is beaten, he is not standing, velo yoshev, nor should he be seated. Ella, however, what position should he be in? Muta. Muta means he's inclining. So I would have to think that he is leaning over something when he receives these stripes. So now, lefanav, I said was before the judge. That's how I initially interpret this. But there's other ways. That is, before him could refer to the judge, but it could also refer to the person who's receiving the stripes. And because it's lefanav kedei rishato, because it says rishato means according to his wickedness, and that's clearly referring to the guilty party, right? So here we go, right? So he says it before him, meaning to be beaten on his chest, essentially, right? According to his wickedness. L'charav, and behind him, in other words, on his back, kadesh time, right? Twice as much. So you'll see how this all works out. Mikan Amru, from this they said, Malkin oto shteyadot milacharav. Here we go, that he is given corporal punishment twice the amount on his back, vishalish milfanav, and 1/3 from in front, in his front. So you can see this is a pretty awful, awful kind of situation. And I will tell you that in discussing these particular laws regarding corporal punishment, it is also considered equivalent to a death penalty. Not equivalent in the sense that in a case of a capital case, you can do this instead. I don't believe that's what it's about. But what it's saying is that just as a capital punishment totally absolves the person of the guilt of what they have committed, likewise, I suspect they're talking about this as well. And some laws that involve capital punishment, I believe, apply then also in a situation of corporal punishment. So, bemispar, it's again in the verse, by according to numbers. So the point here grammatically, if you know a little bit of basic Hebrew grammar, you know that there is um, a form of a noun, right, that is called the construct state. That's the technical grammatical term for this noun. So there is the state of, I can give you an example. The word, what it refers to is that this noun is vocalized in such a way that it is in a possessive state. So for example, bayit is the Hebrew word for house. But if we want to talk about a school or a schoolhouse, right? It's not bayit sefer, it's beit sefer. So that form of that noun, bayit, which is now in the form of beit, and there are grammatical rules as to how the noun is vocalized, right, becomes the house of the book. That's literally how you would translate that. So school in Hebrew is house of the book. So be mispar is in this construct state. So Rashi points this out. He says, "Ve'eno nakud," and it is not vocalized ba mispar, according to the number, but according to a number, right? And also lamed, he says, so you have to infer from this. Shehu davuk. Davuk means it is in the construct state, that this bimispar is a noun in the construct state, but it's not telling you in other words, number of, and it doesn't tell you anything beyond that. Balomar. So what it's doing is telling you that the number they're really referring to is arba'im, right? The number to or of 40. The lo arba'im shleimim, but not a total number of 40. It's not saying that, in other words, it means the way we're understanding it is a number that approximates to 40. Ela minyan, so we're talking about a number, shehu sochem umashlim, right? That is associated in counting. Sochem means completes, right? And again, mashlim means again to associate with or to complete la arba'im to 40. And what's the number that is up to 40? Vehein arba'im chaser achad. We're talking now about 40 less 1. And what the Torah is, how we understand this, is that the Torah is talking about the maximum amount of stripes that you can award a person if they're guilty of an infraction that requires corporal punishment. That's how we understand this. And of course, it goes on. So here, what's interesting, of course, is that in the Torah, there are none of these particular punctuation marks, none of this. But we have a tradition as to Terishato Bamispar, which would conclude the sentence. But because the next word is Arba'im in the Torah, it's like Mispar Arba'im, right? The number that goes up to 40. Yakenu lo Yosif, right? So, but we read it as a new sentence. In other words, he should be beaten 40, lo Yosif, and no more than 39 is really what we're saying, right? Pen Yosif, right? Lahakoto al Ela Makaraba, lest he continue to beat him regarding over above the 39. Makaraba, a huge beating. Venikla achicha la'enecha, and your brother should be humiliated before you, right, in your eyes, because he is receiving so much of a punishment. Well, I have to confess that 39 sounds like a pretty high number to me, and how a person would have to, be able to endure 39, in other words, 13 in front and 26 on his back sounds pretty awful to me. And but again, it's a maximum, and they really, really, really want to prevent this stuff from ever having to take place. They don't want to be doing this. They want to put a stop to any situation where a person deserves such punishment. This is, not everything. Obviously, you've already discovered that there are certainly areas in the Torah which require a lot of meditation and a lot of understanding. Lo Yosif, right? He should not add any more. Mikan azhara. So from this, it is a warning. Lemakeh et chavero. In other words, in general, that we shouldn't be using fisticuffs. We shouldn't use the only place where it might be appropriate, or should I say, go as far as saying where it is appropriate to actually inflict corporal punishment or hurt, to beat someone, is in this situation where a court has to award it because of a person's behavior, but not for general beating. In other words, that when you smack someone else, when you physically attack someone else, you are violating a commandment right here. Benikle achicha, that your brother is humiliated. And it's lovely. This is actually a wonderful, wonderful statement here. It says, Kol hayom kor'o rasha. Remember, if you looked up to this point, this person who's receiving this corporal punishment is referred to as the wicked one. Umisheluka, right? And once he is beaten, karo achicha, he is called your brother. And of course, that is another issue in terms of justice. Is there people who pay the price for their crime? They've paid their price to society, and yet their debt to society, and yet they continue to be treated in society as if they're guilty. And this is an incredible statement here in the Torah, right? In the midst of some very challenging material that we've just had to go through. And yet to say that once a person has paid their debt, they should, it's over, it's done, and they need a fresh start. They need to be given that fresh start. And with this, I'm going to end our reading for today and set up for the next time we get together on this particular parsha to be able to do this. Ooh, let's see what I can do here. Here we go. Okay. And see if I can set the bookmark. And here we go. Okay. Any thoughts, comments for the record, if you want?
According to the Torah, you can only give 40 lashes, no
No,
more.
no, you can't give 40. You can only give 39.
Oh,
Remember,
that's
that
right.
was the interpretation we had.
Yeah,
Yeah.
39 is right. Yeah. Why, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I can't explain any further, other than the idea, I think, is that you have to give just enough for it to be effective. And it isn't saying what it's saying really, what we were reading was a maximum of 39.
Oh,
You may not have to give 39.
depends on the situation. Yeah.
Course. It depends on the situation itself. And it depends, and I mean, there's a whole discussion of whether, the person's physical condition, because if the person is in tip-top physical condition, they may easily be able to endure, or easily is the wrong word, but at least physically be able to endure this. But on the other hand, if they're elderly or, and or if they're somewhat sick, etc., they couldn't. And the
That's
point,
right.
the whole context as you're reading here, that we're reading here, is that it has to be just. It has to be appropriate. So they have to figure it out, what's appropriate. But of course, in our own society where we don't administer corporal punishment, right? I mean, we have to be able to take that into consideration. So, any other thoughts before I stop? Yes, Mead.
No, I mean, it's just the term, which may be archaic, was, in terms of current punishment, that
Mhm.
one has served his debt or paid his debt to society.
Right.
And and that's pretty much what they are implying here.
Right.
But in reality, some debts, in the view of many people, are never repaid.
Right.
And so the punishment is administered, but the problem remains that they are judged or treated as if they had not paid that debt.
I know. I know.
Yeah.
And it's possible, since we're talking about it, that when people see what's going on, they might be more inclined to forgive that person. I can only visualize how scary and awful and emotionally, charged watching someone get beaten like that
Sure. Sure.
is just incredible. The other thing that occurs to me is how little the Torah speaks about the prison system. And, of course, we are heavily dependent on the prison system. And whether or not the prison system, in the broad aspect of discussing jurisprudence, is a fairer way to punish people than this. I mean, I think that we can infer from this that the Torah really doesn't want to make people have to leave society and be isolated. It does refer to, well, there is a kind of prison system if you're talking about the situation for someone who, in the case of manslaughter, right? But it's not prison in the way that we
No.
understand
No.
prison with jailers and things like that. And the thing that I can only again imagine, because I haven't done any studying of this at all, what the prison system has to be like for the people who have to endure it. And I can only imagine that for some, they'd rather get beaten and have it over and done with than have to endure years in a prison.
Sure. Yep. Okay.
We want people to be able to function.
Yep.
So there's some really good stuff to think about in terms of what we've done today. So,
Mhm.
all right, I'm going to stop the recording.